Welcome to the HackerNoon podcast.
The Walking in Colorado edition. We just heard some news, so really this is like a raw, unfiltered 10 minutes might be shit content that you might be about to hear, but whatever, we'll try.
And pardon if the audio's bad, that's the wind. We're walking by a skate park.
Also skateboarders.
There are people at the skate park, I can report, in Colorado. And anyway, so the news, so it's about 10 minutes, so audio's too bad, just drop off, pick another HackerNoon podcast, or don't. Anyway, to the news. The deal is, Joe Rogan announced today, he is taking his podcast exclusively to Spotify. For an undisclosed amount, he is licensing all of his content. Up until September, it'll be available on multiple networks. And then, at the end of the year, exclusively on Spotify. So I don't know if that means remove past content from iTunes and YouTube. So that's the news of the day. This is
It's huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the king of the internet has switched location of his kingdom, to a different country.
I mean, he's the largest independent podcaster in the world. So, and he's saying now, my content's exclusively available on Spotify. This follows Spotify's acquisitions of the Ringer Podcast Network, Gimlet, Anchor, and I think a few others. So they've really been buying up in the space. And on top of that, those deals were all acquisitions. So, they're taking on, they own the assets, they own all the IP. This is a licensing deal more like what Friends would get from Netflix. So he owns the content. It can only legally be accessed there. And he's licensing it out. So the model, it's pretty appealing when you have that kind of demand. But it's a little frustrating to think, why do I have to use this podcast player? What if I prefer another podcast player? So, if all the top podcast players say we're exclusively here, well, that's the chicken and egg of the market, and now they're going to get all the listeners. And, but there really is no necessary reason for why iTunes and Google have a large podcast share other than the adoption of their phone. So when you think about the strategy to gain the market, it's, hey, we'll put the default app on your phone, and that's where you start. So every phone you sell is a new user. Plus, if you buy, if you buy another phone that's with Android, you could end up. But there's a lot of podcast players. I don't know if it's good for the market for Spotify to become more powerful, but I don't think any of the podcast players are amazing products. I think they all could have just a better experience. Not to say that they're bad experiences now. It's just I think there is product opportunity to get better. And when that's true, more money going into the space is probably a good thing for the end user.
Now, let's think about it from Joe Rogan's perspective. What do you think triggered the move? I mean, obviously there must have been long conversations over months, maybe even longer than that, back and forth between him and Spotify. But I would imagine YouTube was made to know of this news. They've got to be, that's where most of his traffic, I think, comes from. Either that or the Apple podcast. Definitely not Spotify right now.
Spotify must have outbid the YouTube revenue.
Right. So what do you think is why so arrogant, YouTube? Is my question. In those conversations, what is their leverage against him?
Well, he's certainly, and a lot of his guests have, gone hard against censorship and saying YouTube being, the platform and the editor is questionable, and so there's some fight there. But I think that also could be just used as excuse for power players when really this just comes down to as simple as money. Who's willing to bid more to license my content over the next 5 years? He's at the level of power where he can just say that to both of them. And, you bid, and the other one bids, and, that's what you get. So I think it could be a changing point of the internet, or it could just be, hey, this is no different than, all of one large network's content going to Netflix. Which, that was pretty big. Getting all the Office subscribers to be Netflix subscribers, pretty smart deal. That's why it's not going to last forever. And that's, again, because NBC owns the rights to that. Joe Rogan owns the rights to his podcast. So as you own your content and you license it out to more places, you hit different stages of, hey, in the beginning, it's better to be everywhere and be on every podcast player. But sometimes it's like, where do you block access in order to maximize, your money? And in this deal, he's saying it's worth it for Spotify to acquire enough new podcast users to pay this exorbitant amount, and it's going to come out, I think, at some point. It's just like, hell, he should tell the story when he's ready, That's on his podcast. That's probably like the simplest thing to do.
I also wonder if this has got anything to do with like the coronavirus, anything surrounding just worsened culture war between all the major networks and independent content creators. In the case of Rogan, I think he's a lot more than one individual content creator, but he's definitely not the mainstream media. Like, he prides himself and he positions himself as like part of the alternative, the indie, culture. And
with the deep, intimate style, it works. Doing these long-form, one-on-one interviews, when someone makes it to the end of that, you have someone that's going to remember you for a very long time. And he's at the point where his team around him is a machine, getting great content, great research. He knows about the guests he's talking about, and he has enough. It's enough of a balanced conversation that even if you don't like the guest or you lose interest, he's still Joe, and you can listen to Joe talk to somebody.
I also think the coronavirus and the whole quarantine thing really narrows the gap between the mainstream media and the internet culture. Like all these celebrities, like late night shows now just have like a webcam and some very swiftly handmade signs, and like that's it. That's their show. And you see like all of this, amazing.
Like the difference between me and you, it's not production value. Production value is level field now. It's all about talent.
It's not about...
It's about community.
Yeah, it's not about that stage fly. It's not about having like...
Marrying
your... PDs.
It's about marrying your super fans during a news show. Like some good news.
Yeah, it's really just about like who is the most trusted voice. And like he thinks that, like the way he's making this deal, at least from the outlook of it, really feels like he's treating himself and regarding his whole brand as like an empire, like a show, like someone who has long tail value that can't be bullied by a network. Like, I think that's the first, I think, that I've heard of anyone from the internet culture really that has anything like that. Don't you think? Like, except for like a couple of special shows here and there on Netflix.
That's why the terms are exciting, because he is at a level no one's at. There's just no one this big in podcasts. And then where do you get the level of like, okay, if you compare him to, say, the most famous news anchor, he has more listeners, right? That would like the first time you put audio on the internet, that could never.
Yeah, I'm like thinking of like Anderson Cooper or like the likes, right? Like, is that?
Yeah, like on monthly listen, who has more, Anderson Cooper or Joe Rogan? I think it's Joe Rogan.
Or like Chris Cuomo.
Yeah,
like that kind of personalities. Yeah, he I think he has more than that. I mean, that guy, what's that name? Bill Cosby? No, what's Bill Ma?
Yeah,
Not Cosby. That's a predator.
No Bill Cosby jokes here.
It was not intentional, but the Bill Maher guy. How do you say his name? Bill.
Let's just call him Bill.
Yeah. He like asked to be on the show. It wasn't like, oh, he has such a big name and this big show, a host of this like big television network. No, like he asked to be on the show, and after many times he got on there. So really, I feel like the table has turned at some point around the past, I want to say like 4 or 5 years, like it is like the quarantine, the whole corona thing doesn't really break the system. It just basically accelerates the trend that we've already seen happening. Is like internet people and internet culture, like the less polished production value content people and perceived more authentic people, and now rising. The mainstream media is really struggling to kind of keep up, and
And that is true. They are struggling to keep up. It's really leveling the playing field.
How do you feel about it, like, personally? Like, what's your feeling?
If you're really putting the listeners number one, I think you'd want to be listed everywhere. But you could say, if I get a good deal set up for a licensing thing, I can give the listeners more into the show. I can figure out bigger ways to make like little businesses around this that make more money. And then when there's like, I don't know, I'm a little torn. There's just always a trade-off. You have to monetize content at some point.
Yeah.
It's coming from and he can do it so many different ways. I fundamentally like that his philosophy is own the content, license it out. And I think that's where all creation, if you build off of there for creators on the internet, I think you're going to end up in a good place. And there's many different ways to get there because you own the asset. It's like, imagine being a business, paying someone to build something, and they build it, and it's theirs. And they're not the company's. Like, a company would always want to own the thing. Even if it's just, if the individual creator owns it, it's better. And so I'm curious where it goes with Spotify, how Spotify can level up audio online, who else is going to maybe get involved, and this is creating a moat. If the challenge is just create a great podcast player.
A highway.
Yeah. If the challenge is just create a great podcast player, anyone could compete. But if you can't get Joe Rogan and the other top influencers, best podcasts out there in your app, you can't win with a better product. So Spotify's making big time business development deals, building a lot of software around podcasting, and this podcast market is not shrinking. So I'm just kind of going to watch where it goes.
Yeah. Same here.
All right. If you want more of these, just let us know. 10 minutes, 15, whatever. Enjoy it. Stay safe.
Bye. This has been David and Linh. I realized that we never said our names. From HackerNoon.
Is that what it is? Yeah. HackerNoon podcast.